The good execution again is going to go first back to alignment, getting everybody on the same page. And I think the easiest correlation to that would be, going to a symphony and listening to an orchestra play, right? If you have 50 musicians and every musician is playing a different sheet of music, it's not going to sound that great. So everybody in the organization has to be on the same sheet of paper. Now there's a challenge with that, and part of that comes down to education, right? But people need to understand, again, what they're being measured, how they're being measured, and more importantly, how the measurement affects the work that they're doing. So the tendency is these value creation plans don't think about capacity. They just think about things that need to be done, and they make the assumption of infinite capacity. The reality is they almost need to be done like a project plan, a Gantt chart, where they're sequenced properly. So yeah, in a hold period, I might need to introduce a CRM. I might need to introduce an ERP. Maybe I need to do a major transition in the manufacturing environment to robotics and automation. The question becomes, which one do you sequence first? Which one do you do second? Which one do you do third? Now, the value there may be that the total timeline is extended, but if you try to jam them all together, then nothing's going to get done.
Most value creation plans don't fail because they're wrong. Most fail because the organizations really don't have the culture or understanding to absorb them. The plan looks good in the deal room, the math checks out, it all sums up, and then reality hits on day one. And somewhere between the strategy and the people who actually have to do the work, the plan in the organization stop fitting together. Our guest today has spent the last 2 decades in that gap. Wayne Marhelski, I hope I said that Wayne correctly, has worked with multiple PEs in multiple different businesses, in successful turnarounds in defense, industrial, and aftermarket, and rebuilt the execution capability each time. So Wayne, thank you for joining us today. Appreciate it.
Thank you for the invite. Glad to be here.
Yeah, very excited to have you on. Been a big fan of your content on LinkedIn and your insights. So I'm looking forward to doing a deep dive today.
Great. Yeah. Sounds good.
So Wayne, before we get into the details, because there's always details, maybe help the audience understand the beginning. You've been in all these different turnarounds in a number of different industries, but where did Wayne start in private equity? Like, what was the precipice of you getting into it?
Yeah, so my first experience with private equity was, pre-telecom collapse. Just about a year and a half before that collapse, the company I was with, Claremont Electronics, had been acquired by a small PE group. So that was actually my first, hearing of the term private equity, to be honest. Did a couple transformations, and then ultimately 2007, I stepped into a turnaround in a private equity division of a private equity owned company, when I was with Census. So, that kind of put me on that trajectory. But leading up to that, again, my focus really being heavily on lean manufacturing and operational excellence and driving excellence throughout the operations as a whole, kind of let me see what the opportunity was, or, maybe what other people ignored. Again, I consider myself to be a recovering engineer. So I kind of, look at the operations and look at the manufacturing side, and maybe I see something that other people don't, or they just don't want to see it, because I don't think it's complicated. But yeah, ultimately, I, just prior to going into that operational turnaround, I had interviewed with a private equity owned company for their operations group. And, went through like 7 rounds of interviews. And the last round, it was me and one other individual. And they're like, well, you don't have an MBA. And I'm like, well, I didn't have an MBA when I started, in all fairness. So, I decided I was going to go get my MBA while I was working. And that kind of led me to my 2009 dissertation, which was the effects of lean manufacturing on private equity and benefits. I'm sorry, the effects of lean manufacturing on EBITDA and benefits to private equity.
Mm.
So I've kind of been down this, down this rabbit hole since 2000, at least 2009, I consider it.
That's awesome. Well, interesting. It's I might hold that lean question a little later.
Yes.
Okay.
In my DMAIC days, I don't know how patient private equity has been with you in the lean process, but I'd be curious to get your reaction to that.
It'll be an interesting one because, my first, the DMAIC, I started with Six Sigma back in, the Motorola days.
Yeah.
So, I remember when it was
Eerie
pretty
rumbling.
rigorous.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm sure our stories overlap pretty well.
Yes. I will tell. Yeah, we probably do. Let's maybe setting a little bit of theme here for a second. So in your piece, and I'm looking at my notes, so full disclosure to everyone, execution capacity is the real ceiling on private equity returns. I want to make sure I get that right. You wrote that discussions about returns often focus on the markets, multiples, and timing, but really don't explain why the outcomes fail to materialize. Can you elaborate a little bit on that, like to the audience?
Yeah, there's been a tendency, and again, it's interesting that Bain and McKinsey are starting to, over the past, let's say 3 to 6 months now, are starting to write about it. I don't think they would have written about it, a decade ago, of how the operations is really the driver for the business. Because again, you can take the premise of when you're sitting in a deal room, developing a thesis, looking at an acquisition. Everything you're doing is making assumptions. And ideally, you're weighing the pros and the cons, what's my worst case, what's my best case scenario, in order to evolve that into the final thesis and ultimately the investment in that portco. But nobody really talks about what the portco can deliver. There's a lot of things that people will talk about, hey, what's our interest rate we're going to do, what's going to be the secondary loans or whatever, how we structure the deal. But nobody thinks to ask the questions, even in due diligence, of, hey, can this deal team actually deliver on any of that? Or are we going to have to replace the C-suite in month 6? And the trend now seems to be, every 2 years at least, there's some type of changeover within the C-suite. It's kind of a running joke, I think, in that regards. But the basics, right? The fundamentals. In sports, you always hear the phrase blocking and tackling, getting back to the basics. But PE doesn't necessarily do that. And I don't fault PE for doing that or not doing it, because they've had access to easy money. They've had access to another group of buyers sitting on dry powder who needed to put it to work. And they're working under the same premise as well of, I'm going to buy it, hold it for 2 to 3 years, and then somebody's going to come along who's going to want a piece of that action. And I can just sell it to them.
Yeah.
Because they're also making money in some cases on the backside as well through management fees, transactional fees, et cetera.
Yeah. Let me ask you, so maybe a two-parter question. Sometimes these value creation plans just don't work. They're typically written by non-operators, although that's evolving. I will say I've seen the evolution as of recent where they're pulling in operators to help with the validation of the value creation plan before they build a platform. But in the past, they may have gotten a cursory review of someone they knew or an existing CEO they had in their portfolio companies. Is the problem the value creation plan itself? Is it the execution, or is it, I'll call it, you said you poked around at it. There's a little bit of you're building a platform, your baseline is this multiple that you buy a EBITDA at, right? And then you start immediately acquiring businesses at something less than that multiple. So you kind of get drunk on the arbitrage that's created, right? And you lose sight of, hey, there's better value to be created in actually doing the work. Like, just interested, two-parter question, but interested in your reaction to that.
So, when I was having conversation, when I was writing my dissertation, I remember the one year I had a good case of the flu, and I sat there and I probably went through, I'll just say 100 plus websites of private equity companies. And again, smart folks, you're not diminishing them in any way, but every one of them talked about being operators.
Mm.
But then as I'm looking through, the portfolio or the profiles of these folks, their accounting backgrounds, their finance backgrounds, their consulting, they came out of McKinsey or wherever. Again, smart folks, smart people, but they didn't necessarily have that down in the trenches, getting underneath a piece of equipment to figure out why it's not working mentality or capability.
Mm.
So, they had their lane, right? And there's nothing wrong with that. And again, they were able to go in, buy a company at a 4x multiple, kind of do a little bit with it, hold it, sell it off, or convince somebody that it's worth 6x now, take the money and go on their merry way. If somebody's seeing success in that, there's not really a lot of reason for them to change the game plan, right? There's not a lot of reason for them to change the playbook. But I remember conversations back in 2009 trying to promote this concept of how, and again, it was very heavily based on lean manufacturing principles. To let's sit there and let's really dig into the operations and focus on it. Census, for instance, when I started there, our running joke was that we did not buy any raw materials unless it was within a 20-mile radius, which is crazy. So our percentage of sales for material costs was around 52 to 53%. We went through and did a complete redo of our supply chain, and ended up driving material costs down to about 43% of sales.
Wow.
That is a massive impact to EBITDA. Huge. When we were seeing our top line revenue declining, again, 2008, recession, nobody's buying homes, so nobody needs new meters or gas meters on the side of their home. So, you're kind of, the industry's kind of cannibalizing from one another. And yet we are growing EBITDA. That's phenomenal. When I was with another one in a radiation space, that industry or that division, shortly after acquisition, had not made any money in 17 years. It was set up as a cost center. It was allowed to exist because of what they made was so unique that they had everybody convinced, and had to do some restructuring with that. But ultimately, we were growing at 36% year over year on the top line, but 170% on the bottom line. And that was heavily built off, lean manufacturing, good operating principles, having the right people in the right seats, and getting everybody aligned, which that alignment goes back really to the execution reason why I think a lot of value creation plans don't meet their success rate. There's that lack of alignment.
Yeah, I agree. As someone who's been in a number of different platforms, I think there is misalignment, and sometimes there's mixed messaging. Even if the value creation plan is right, and here you are running hard to do acquisitions or do some financial engineering or something like that, you start to lose sight of where you started.
Right.
And your blocking and tackling comment is dead on. It's what I tell my people all the time. Like, I'm in fire, life, and safety. I'm like, got to get the inspections done. Got to make sure our projects and our POC is done properly. Got to make sure our technician and our revenue generating folks are all taken care of. Like, getting the basics right is a heavy lift in and of itself. And people lose sight of that because they get wrapped up in all that kind of what I'll call fun stuff, and they ignore where the business actually has the most success.
Well, there's even a struggle with translation too. Engineers don't talk like accountants and finance people, who don't necessarily talk like marketing people, right? So there's this translation element that needs to happen within an organization. And again, it goes back to the alignment of what are we really trying to do? What are we really measuring? And do we all understand what we're measuring?
Yeah. So you cited McKinsey, Bain, Simon Kucher, and others, right, about financial engineering and the move away from financial engineering and more of this like operational value creation, which, like, hey, as someone sitting in the seat, we know and we feel that now.
Right.
What's your view of why that's changing in the industry, where they're finally starting to see operational value versus, the financial engineering side?
Um, I hate to sit there and say, well, because they're all out of excuses, right? But I think that the reality is finally setting in. And again, I think this is cyclical. I think at some point we're going to be back to
Yep.
exactly what it was, right? These things go in cycles. And anybody that wants to debate that, that would be a separate conversation. But just look at what happened in 2008. They kind of sat there and said, hey, none of some of these aspects or some of these things that are going on are no longer allowed. And then 2 years later, they kind of started to creep back in under different names. So I think some of this is cyclical, but I think the firms that are really going to be successful in the future and moving forward are going to be the ones who really truly embrace it.
Yeah.
That want to get down into the details and really want to understand what it means to manage that P&L line for materials, what it means to manage all the aspects of the direct labor line. Those are the firms that are really going to be successful.
Yeah. So is it because a lot of 2020, 2021 vintage portfolio companies are still being held, exits, we're not seeing a lot of exits, hold periods are getting longer, like what is making this, even if it's cyclical, what's making this comeback to operational improvement?
Mike, just a little bit of input, and maybe Wayne, you could react to this statement. Capital is expensive right now. It just is, right? So there was this period of time between 2008, 2009, and probably right after COVID, where inflation kicked into high gear and interest rates started to materially come up, where now it's like, well, it's expensive and we actually have to extract real value. When you start borrowing north of 10% interest rates, you got to deliver real value incrementally to the P&L, or honestly, you start to risk not making your loan payments. So, but interested in your perspective of that, Wayne.
Yeah, so I think a lot of these companies now that are reaching that 7-year mark, and again, you go back to the days of early COVID, whatever, where interest rates were next to nothing.
Yeah.
To your point, interest rates aren't next to nothing anymore, right? They're not close to zero. No value, none of the value creation plans have really been implemented. And here's a perspective. So back in December, looked at a acquisition, and this was a company in the aerospace defense industry, 3 locations. First platform was purchased in 2017, second in 2018, third in 2019, right? So we're looking at this company now that had been hobbled together for about 6 years, a little longer. December 2025, the bank basically took over the deal process. The bank basically set the PE firm aside and said, you know what, we're exiting. We know that we have to take a haircut, but this can't go on anymore. So again, you would think that in 2017, 2018, 2019, there'd been some integration work. There would have been some, value added work that was done within the companies, within the portcos, to, bring them together as one platform. Never happened. And I think that's the problem out there. As I think you've got a lot of companies. I think the total number is somewhere around 31,000 portcos, give or take. And the majority of those are now starting to creep up to that 6+ year mark. Nobody's done anything with them. So I think fundamentally they're good companies. But if you don't give or create the value to pay down the debt, or have the value that can justify a higher multiple, then why would somebody want to buy it?
Yeah.
And again, most of PE firms or portcos, they're sold to other portcos or they're sold to other PE firms. The industry kind of cannibalizes itself in many ways. I don't know what the percentage of would be of PE firms that typically would go to IPO or be sold to a strategic. I don't know that number. But the majority, I would say, is they're sold to other PE firms. Well, if the PE firm can't justify that buy-in, what I call the entry imprinted point, and I really think that the acquisition point is what determines what that hold is going to look like.
Yeah. A little bit on like the execution side of value creation for a second, Wayne. Maybe tell us a little bit about when you saw a value creation plan that was like really executed well, and maybe, conversely, one that wasn't executed so well, and like, why did that second one fail, and what was the difference between the two? Like, just maybe some examples. You've had plenty of history there, so it might be helpful for us to hear some of your examples.
Good execution versus bad execution.
Yeah. So the good execution again is going to go first back to alignment, getting everybody on the same page. And I think the easiest correlation to that would be, going to a symphony and listening to an orchestra play, right? If you have 50 musicians and every musician is playing a different sheet of music, it's not going to sound that great. So everybody in the organization has to be on the same sheet of paper. Now there's a challenge with that, and part of that comes down to education, right? I don't think that the average person is dumb or anything, but people need to understand again what they're being measured, how they're being measured, and more importantly, how the measurement affects the work that they're doing, right?
Can you give us an example of that? Like, what does that look like in practice, Wayne? So we hear alignment, we hear.
Yeah. So if you think about cash flow, let's take cash flow because that's a great example. Every business can utilize good cash flow. How does that impact somebody in purchasing or somebody on the shop floor side? So and I'm going to use census as a perfect example of this. This took about a 3-4 month period where we were doing it, monthly meetings, walking people through our metrics, explaining to them, what the metrics meant, how they could impact it, to the point where after about the 4th, 5th month, we actually had somebody on the shop floor be like, hey, I've got a pallet of material sitting over here in this corner and it's got a lot of dust on it, but the parts look good. Can we utilize those? And if we utilize those, is that going to save us money from having to buy more materials? 100%. So you start getting people engaged. They have to know, and it's not these massive things, right? It's a lot of little pieces that start to fall into place. So alignment is a big piece. What's the strategy? Does everybody know it? I always kind of cringe when I hear business owners be like, well, we don't really think that everybody in the organization needs to know that. Look, if you want to build trust, throw it out there.
Yeah.
Again, there are no secrets in a manufacturing environment. The people understand what's going on in the business. They may not know about it in the financial terms, but they can see when the orders are slowing down or orders from a certain customer haven't materialized when they typically do. They know when something's changing or something's shifting.
But how do you translate cash flow to someone on the shop floor or to a technician, right? Because it's not a metric that they look at every day. It's not something that they encounter every day. So how do you make it relevant?
So, but for them, it's about velocity, right? So from their perspective, order to cash cycle is absolutely critical. I don't think enough businesses actually really look at that. But it's about the velocity of the product getting through the factory. And if it's going to take somebody, 3 to 5 days to get something through the factory, and now we can sit there and show them ways, whether it's through lean manufacturing or demand flow technology or through introduction of automation, that we can now get it in 1 day. That's something we can directly point to that's going to have a positive, impact on the cash flow. For somebody in the buying, that's in the buying world, and purchasing, it's how they negotiate the contracts. It's the routes that they want to bring product in. At one point I could get product in from, China to the West Coast in like 16 days.
Mm.
East Coast would be 26 days,
Mm.
through the canal. In some cases now to get it through the East Coast, it's upwards of 30 plus days, 40
Mm.
days. So depending on what your Incoterms are, who owns that product at what stage of the travel has an impact on cash flow as well.
And how do you make them care about that outcome? How do you create real alignment? And, is it through incentives, other than bringing visibility? How do you make them care about driving those outcomes?
I'm a big believer in profit sharing, right? If you're going to ask people to kind of put their best foot forward, I'm a big believer in putting in some type of incentive program to kind of help make that happen, right?
For everyone
Everybody
in the
gets
organization, not just the leadership team?
Correct. Everybody in the organization.
Okay.
So like, again, I'll pick on Census. We had a quarterly bonus program. And, so every month, we shared our metrics. We shared our revenue.
Mm.
Everybody knew what the quality performance was, what our returns were on the warranty side, what our cash flow was, what our EBITDA was. And we had those conversations of, hey, we need to sit there and try to get more product or make some changes over in this area versus this area. But at the end of the quarter, everybody tracked it and everybody got a bonus. Everybody got paid out. So you got to you got to be willing to share some of the opportunity or share some of the benefit.
Yeah.
If you really want people to grab onto it and care.
Yeah. On the service side of the world, I find the same, but on top of that, you see what we have done a number of times is kind of share the relevancy to the work that they do. Like I tell technicians, collections are important to you because we need to get paid for all the hard work that you do.
Right.
Like you're putting in all the sweat equity to get the work done. Us getting paid is a validation of you, right? So it's not. So I think there's a message there that people can ascribe to say, hey, yeah, I'm kind of worth it. I should get, the company should get paid. I was there and I was sweating half the day and I'm owed that. But if you don't have those conversations, I agree with Wayne, it's really hard, right? You want to build integrity and trust with people. You have to have that level of conviction to have that detail of a conversation, all the way down to the employee that, produces revenue at the, I'll say lowest level, but the context doesn't mean bad. It's just like,
Right.
the lowest common denominator in the organization. They have to hear from you directly. So
Right.
Agree. So, okay, Wayne, lots of experience, got new people walking into new platforms with these cool value creation plans that look great in the 60 slides they're getting. How can they diagnose whether the organization can actually execute it? What's being asked within that plan, like the detail of that plan. Like if I'm a new guy and I'm walking in and I have this cool deck someone just gave me, and maybe they even gave me a playbook.
You paid a lot of money for.
Yeah, maybe they even gave me a playbook. How do I validate? How do I say this is going to work, this is not going to work, or how do I make it work? Maybe just a couple different perspectives with that.
Yeah, so that's a great question, and that's kind of the crux of where success is won or lost. I try to think about things in mathematical terms or concrete terms. So I've kind of built this model that kind of works, which for me it makes sense, right? Somebody else may have a different take on it, but we tend to think that, well, we can just cascade initiatives throughout an organization. That's probably one of the biggest links of failure that I think really people ignore. And what I mean by that is, somebody at the C-suite, let's take the C-suite, they've got a lot more flexibility in what they do or what they work on, right? Just by virtue of that. But as you move down throughout the organization, those people have less flexibility and they're closer in just to the day-to-day, firefighting, blocking and tackling that goes on. So when you look at these initiatives, is it something that you can handle at a higher level, or is it something that's got to get down into the mid-level? And I think the mid-level is really the piece that really ensures things get done. I don't think that middle layer is given enough credit in many instances. but they're the ones that have to do the balancing act between, hey, today I'm going to sit there and I got to work on the production schedule. I got to manage time cards. I have to make sure everybody actually showed up today. And I have to be a bit of a therapist because I got two individuals who aren't getting along, right? A lot of their time is just absorbed in the day-to-day stuff. So if you think initiatives are just going to get jammed down into that level, like that's a recipe for failure.
Yeah.
So you have to look at what's how much time it's going to take, how complex it is. Let's take an MRP implementation. That's a process that's going to cut across finance and accounting, likely HR, definitely engineering, definitely operations, purchasing, supply chain, pretty much every aspect of the business. That's a lot of people that it's going to pull away from. So if you're going to work on that, there's no reason why somebody should assume that they can also work on 2 or 3 other major initiatives as well. So the tendency is these value creation plans don't think about capacity. They just think about things that need to be done, and they make the assumption of infinite capacity. The reality is they almost need to be done like a project plan, a Gantt chart, where they're sequenced properly.
Yeah.
So in a hold period, I might need to introduce a CRM. I might need to introduce an ERP. Maybe I need to do a major transition in the manufacturing environment to robotics and automation. The question becomes, which one do you sequence first? Which one do you do second? Which one do you do third?
Yeah.
Now,
and
the value there may be that the total timeline is extended. But if you try to jam them all together, then nothing's going to get done.
Yeah. So as what I think I hear you saying is part of the value creation challenges, and I agree with it, is you had a quote: growth does not create operational capacity, it consumes it. I agree. I think a couple of things, and I want you to react to this, that come to mind as you're talking. One is the idea of like overlapping, like this person's real full-time job, as an example, is an AP manager, but they're going to be involved in the MRP or ERP implementation, whether you want them to or not. They have to be, because they're a critical stakeholder in the role. But this job is not a part-time job. Like everyone forgets, like that their core function is full-time. So now you're adding this new role, then all of a sudden there's a third one and a fourth one, and they don't do the how much capacity do each of these people or roles have to give.
But where do you even start? Like, how do you wrap your head around capacity, especially in the lower middle market? Like, you don't like have analytics and everyone's time is tracked and reported and measured, right? A lot of times you're just dealing with spreadsheets, and there's not a lot of data to even start wrapping your head around capacity and utilization. So how do you like actually, get a feel or a measure of capacity so you can start estimating, okay, we have an ERP and it's going to take X amount of time from this guy or that gal. Where do you start, especially in the lower middle market where we operate?
So, the best way to do it is to rip the tie off, throw the jacket or blazer, out the window, put on a t-shirt, roll up the sleeves, go out there and get dirty, because it's an onion that has to be pulled back in many ways. I think you also get better results by doing that approach, because people then see that, you're putting the sweat equity in it, and it's not just saying, hey, go do a Kaizen event, right? Or, go run DMAIC, go run a DMAIC process. So you're asking people, especially if this is a first time, again, lower middle market, first time PE owned, people don't necessarily know what good looks like unless they've seen it. So again, if you start throwing out lean terms, lean manufacturing terms, all the Japanese words that are sexy, sound sexy, if they don't understand what it means or how it gets implemented, nothing happens. And then people stand back and be like, whoa. And this is where I think the PE world kind of struggles, is that, the past, they've kind of sat there and relied on the executive team to drive. And that's true. The executive team should drive. But again, the executive team is also trying to run the business. And this is where I think the operating partner, and in some cases, certain consultants, can kind of be that value adder or that force multiplier. While the team is focusing on, the C-suite and the executive team is focusing on running and managing the business, these force multipliers can come in and start to do these things in parallel.
Yeah.
With them.
One thing, hey Wayne, one thing I have found, I'm interested in your reaction to this, is a true test of the validity of a value creation plan is the ability to want to invest in the resources to actually go do it, right? Has that been your experience? Because sometimes people put all these big numbers, really nice plan together, and then you say, hey, we really need a couple of roles, and here's what they are. It's different for every organization. In order to go do that and drive that value back, they put the brakes on it. They're like, oh, well, we should be able to do it with the people that we got. And it's like, well, then do you really have conviction that this is a plan that can deliver on what you think it can deliver on? So interested in your reaction to that.
No, I think you're 100% on the mark. And I think, again, some of that goes back to, the value creation plans and these theses were developed largely by deal teams, not necessarily operations teams, right? And again, in their defense, automation and robotics, for instance, sounds great. Like I love technology. I love playing with new gadgets. But I need to be able to find time to do that outside of my regular job, and I don't want to say 8 to 5 because there's no 8 to 5 job in the PE world. So that's where you need that force multiplier to come in and kind of start to look at that. If you're talking about shifting from a traditional type manufacturing environment to being much more automated and addition of robotics, again, there's engineering resources that are needed. There's the training elements of that. You're going to probably need to upgrade your maintenance group and your maintenance team to be, more PLC driven and software driven than, mechanics driven. So I think you're spot on there. It's, again, you need all of the right people in the room having an honest conversation. And the earlier that takes place, the more likelihood you can get to a point where you can actually execute.
So maybe before we wrap up, one kind of question for you, for the executives, peers, or aspiring executives, even in some case in the private equity world, what's one piece of advice you would give them that they should be doing right now if they have real intent to execute on a value creation plan?
Oof. One thing that I would do.
Maybe two. So don't worry too much about one or two.
And I think some of this is going to be I think some of this is a cultural aspect. But you have to be willing to hear honest responses. Not sugarcoating, not platitudes, not what people think you want to hear. You need to hear honest responses, and don't take it as an attack. Take it as the opportunity. And the reason I say that is and here's why. When I typically go into a company, I typically ask HR, even some of the supervisors. I'm like, hey, who's the one person in the business that complains the most? And this is very contrary, right? And like, well, why would you want to talk to them? Because they're the one person that truly cares. They haven't put their head in the sand. They're not willing to look the other way. They truly care about success. They may sometimes not say it in the most polite way or, share their thoughts in the most appropriate manners. But what they're saying has merit. You just have to have that conversation with those people. And again, and why I say that's a cultural thing is if you can't have honest conversations in a company, you've got bigger problems.
That's awesome. Thanks, Wayne. Thanks for the candor on that. And wholeheartedly agree with that. Like the only ad I would have, and it's a small one, is try to pull it out of them if they're not giving it to you, because there is some there. It's always
Yes.
there. It's how willing are they to share it with you.
Yeah.
Right.
That I have found.
For me, this conversation, left more questions than opened up a lot of more questions for me, right? The operator in me is just like getting down to, okay, well, how do we estimate capacity, how do we manage capacity, how do we protect capacity from getting eaten by all the integration work, how do you prioritize, um, so I think there's maybe a mini series just around execution capacity, Wayne. There, for those who want to maybe go a little bit deeper, I know you're a very well published, like a better word these days, I'll call you an influencer, right? So where can folks maybe find more of your thinking around this execution gap? And how to address it? Where can folks go to go a little bit deeper into that?
So, I mean, LinkedIn's probably the easiest resource to locate me at. The other one would be my Substack. So I have a Substack that I do a lot, sometimes longer version articles, more deep dive into some specific tools, and that's on the Operational Edge. So it'll be the
Operational
Operational
Edge,
Edge at
Substack, and
Substack.
LinkedIn. Excellent. I'm not going to hold you to it, but maybe it's something we can talk a little bit offline. Getting into the how, right? Because there's a lot of content out there about execution and PMO and planning and transformation, but it's hard to find sometimes something that works for the scrappy lower middle market organization, that where it's just a lot of times there's not much time to really be as systematic as you'd like, because there's just too many things happening at the same time. And I know, at Orgo, being a lower middle market company, we suffer from that as well. It's like, how do you prioritize and how do you focus and how do you protect capacity? So I think this has been a very valuable conversation to me. It's maybe the beginning to maybe on this podcast, or some in another format, to go a little bit deeper on the execution gap and how to plan around capacity, and make sure that when you come up with a plan, it's like, you got to ensure that you're able to execute on it.
Right.
So thank you so much, Wayne, for coming today on the show and sharing your insight, and looking forward to building on today's conversation.
No, thank you again for the invite. I enjoyed it. It was a great conversation.
Thanks,
Nice
Wayne.
meeting both
Appreciate
of
your
you.
time. Thanks, Wayne. Appreciate your time. And to everyone else, see you in the next episode.
See you in the next episode, guys.
Thanks.